Hey everyone, welcome back. We are on chapter 7 of Smoldering Hunger. Uh, we were left on a bit of a cliffhanger in the last video, and I know you're all dying to find out what's going to happen after Darius kisses Dr. Sophie Martin. But first, happy Valentine's Day. I hope all of you had a fantastic day. I hope there was lots of yummy food and chocolate involved, and no, you don't have to be in a relationship to enjoy yummy food and chocolates. Alright, so we're going to dive right into this chapter. Let's find out what happens. Darius was on fire, smoldering from the inside out with an inferno of need that threatened to devour him if he didn't have one more taste of her. In truth, he'd been burning for Sophie's touch before he ever followed Ulrich to the hospital and saw her again. But it was discovering her in the tub that did him in. Yeah, 'cause you're a stalker and you broke into her apartment. He'd known as soon as he walked in that he was a goner, yet he hadn't left. His feet refused to move, and his body demanded he climb into the tub with her and remind her just how loudly he could make her scream. When she opened her eyes, Darius had been transfixed. The way the tendrils of her flame-colored hair clung to the sides of her face and neck was one of the sexiest things he'd ever seen, or would ever see. Then there was the flicker of the candlelight moving seductively over her skin. The knockout punch came when Sophie shifted ever so slightly in the bath. Her breasts rose from the water, parting the thick bubbles. Darius's mouth watered at the sight of her puckered pink nipples. Every bit of blood rushed to his cock as he fought to remain where he stood. What possessed him to walk to her to say farewell? It's called lust. And to tempt himself with another taste of her lips, no matter how light, he must be daft to put himself in such a position. All it took was one sample, one small press of their mouths to push him over the edge. All the yearning, all the hunger he felt for her, that he hadn't told himself was real, came rushing back like a tsunami. It consumed him, devoured him. Leaving was no longer an option. He had to have her again. Darius moaned when her lips moved beneath his. He braced his hands on either side of the tub, even as her arms wrapped around his neck. Water slid down his neck and along his back. Bubbles that clung to her fingers tickled his ear. Water lapped loudly against the sides of the tub when she brought her other arm up to his neck. Darius was supposed to have been in and out of the flat. All he wanted to know was that she was safe, and he needed one last look at her. He wasn't supposed to be kissing her, and he sure as hell wasn't supposed to be thinking of sliding his aching rod between her legs. Oh, the euphemisms. The sounds of bubbles squishing. I didn't know bubbles squished. No. Was nearly as loud as their harsh breathing as... Wait. How is bubbles squishing as loud as their harsh breathing? I've been in bubble baths before. Was nearly as loud as their harsh breathing as he dipped one arm in the water and pressed her against his chest. With the music still playing in the background, Darius kissed her with all the pent-up need and longing he'd been discounting for days. He stood straight, bringing her with him. Water trickled down her body into the sloshing tub. Darius stopped kissing her long enough to see thick handfuls of bubbles sliding down her back, shapely ass and legs returning to the water. "Don't stop," she whispered, with her olive eyes heavy-lidded. Olive eyes? As if he could. Darius bent and scooped her into his arms. He pivoted and carried her dripping wet to the bedroom. Just as he was about to lay her on the bed, she pulled his head down for a kiss. Darius was powerless to pull away. Her kisses had a way of making his brain stop functioning properly. That's what kisses are supposed to do. With just a coax of her lips, he was putty in her hands. He put his knee on the bed and leaned forward, catching them with his free hand. Darius couldn't contain a growl of pleasure when he found himself nestled between her legs. If only his clothes weren't in the way of feeling her sleek, damp skin against his. As if Sophie was thinking the same thing, she yanked his shirt up his shoulders. Darius jerked off the offending garment. His breath locked in his lungs when he felt her breasts against his chest. How could he have even dared to think their first time together would be the best, especially when he hadn't felt or seen all of her? With her hand traveling over his shoulders and down his back, Darius gazed into her eyes that were a beautiful mixture of green and silver. I thought they were olive. He hissed in a breath when she wrapped one long, lean leg around his waist, bringing him closer to her sex. Through his jeans he felt the heat of her core. Her hand paused at his backside, pressing just enough as she ground against him. Darius gritted his teeth as he rocked into her. His cock jumped, aching for more. Does it jump? I've always wondered that. Does it twitch? Does it jump? What happens, guys? 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks was too long to think about Sophie and not take advantage of the time given to them. Darius rose to his elbow and began to grab for the waist of his pants. In a heartbeat, Sophie's hands were there. A second later, he was helping her push them down his hips while he kicked off his boots. It took entirely too long to take off his clothes and once more be against her. But when they lay flesh to flesh, both held quiet and still in the moment, until the passion took over once more. They began to frantically kiss each other. His hands were in her hair, tugging the length free from the pins. Then he was touching her arms, her hips, her legs, before he cupped her breast and found a pert nipple waiting for his attention. When he bent and took the peak into his mouth, her back arched and her nails dug into his back. Darius watched the pleasure move over her face, which only spurred his desire higher. He was so intent on learning the weight of her breasts in his palms, as well as how sensitive her nipples were to his fingers, lips, and mouth, that he didn't know what her hands were about as they roamed over him until she wrapped her fingers around his cock. Wow, this is getting intense. Sophie sizzled through every particle of her body. She was so close to orgasm that if she rocked against Darius once more, she would shatter. It was the yearning to feel his length inside her that kept her still. Was it because she'd gone so long without sex before Darius? Is this book reading my mind? Oh my god, this book is reading my mind. Yes, it is that you've gone so long without sex. Yes. She kept herself busy enough that she didn't think about easing her body too often. Or was it Darius who brought out the shameless abandon, and did it really matter? No. It felt good. He felt good. Sophie ran her hand up and down his thick length as his tongue teased her nipple mercilessly. Each flick, each soft suck drove her closer and closer to the edge. It was only fair that he be there with her. Sophie loved the feel of his arousal. It was like warm velvet gliding over steel. That's one way of describing it. Actually, that's described a lot in a lot of these books. It's like it's the same description that they find in the dictionary somewhere. I'm sure it's in the dictionary somewhere. She hadn't realized he was so large. No wonder he'd stretched her so that first time. It beat a pre-cum form, and she rubbed it around the head of his shaft. After she cupped his ballsack and rolled them around in her palm before she softly scraped her nails over them. Ow. Okay. Maybe he's into that. Darius hissed, his cock jumping in response. She smiled, and in return, he lightly bit her nipple. Sophie cried out from the pleasure as it tightened low in her gut. She could do nothing when he raised her arms above her head and held her there with one strong hand. With a slow, wicked smile, Darius kept eye contact with her as he lowered his head and nipped her breast. Then he drew her nipple deep into his mouth and suckled. No. You do not use that word like this. You don't use the word suckle when you talk about a man doing it. Babies suckle. Men suck, bite, tease. Do not suckle. Ugh. Then he drew her nipple deep into his mouth and suckled while his tongue lapped at the turgid peak. She used turgid. Oh my god, she used turgid. Ugh. While his mouth did wonderful decadent things to her breasts, his hands skimmed along her stomach to her hips. He shifted his body to the side so he could then slide his fingers into the small triangle of red curls at her sex. Why did he say that? Sophie's legs fell open on their own. Her breathing was harsh, her body trembling as she anxiously awaited his fingers to touch her and ease some of her need. But he didn't touch her. Such a tease. Instead, he stroked the inside of both thighs, coming just close enough to her sex that she could feel the warmth of his hand, but never touching. All the while he had her nipples so hard they hurt. Sophie tried to move her hips to get in contact with his hand, but Darius kept out of reach. Her sex throbbed. She was so close to climaxing. He lifted his head and cupped her sex. She stilled instantly at the contact. Then he ran along her sex to her swollen clit and back to her entrance again. I feel weird saying sex. I don't think any woman refers to her area as sex. Is this what you need? He asked. Sophie couldn't form words, so she nodded. One finger slid inside her. Her fingers closed from the bliss. So damn wet, he murmured. I need to taste you. He was nestled between her legs before she knew it. No, she cried as he licked her. Nay? He he asked, pausing long enough to say the word before he found her clit. Sophie gripped the comforter and fought to speak past the rising passion. I want to taste you too. That got him to lift his head and look at her. She waited, her chest heaving as her sex clenched for more. You're dripping wet, he said as he looked down at her. You're very close to release. Yes, but why did that matter? She wanted to know more of him to add to her memories. Because clearly they're never going to have sex again. Feeling his body atop her was amazing, just as it was to learn the thickness of his arms and the width of his shoulders, not to mention his stomach that was lined with hard muscle. Are you sure? He asked with a gleam in his eyes as he circled her clit with his thumb. I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but normally women can have an orgasm and then keep going and do other things. But I guess she's not that type of woman. Darius watched her eyes roll back in her head. Her legs were spread and her sex open to him. Oh my god, that sounds so terrible. She was magnificent. Like a horse. I'm kidding. I know. I totally ruined it for you guys. The little triangle of red curls were trimmed neatly and the rest shaved to show her sex gleaming with her arousal. He spread her woman's lips. Oh no. Oh no. And found her clit. Bending, he lapped at the bud with his tongue while her breathing grew more ragged as soft cries fell from her lips. Her woman's lips? You guys. Women's lips? She tasted as wild and fiery as her passion. Her sex greedily clenched against his finger when he slid a digit inside her. You know how that line could be written? Her sex clenched against his finger when he slid it inside of her. There you go. That's a sentence. Fixed it for you. Just as he suspected, he only had to move his fingers 2 pumps before a hoarse cry filled the room as she peeked. But Darius wasn't nearly done with her. Someone sure of their prowess. Oh my god, you guys. With the walls of her sex still clenching around his finger. I dare you to use that when you guys are having sex. Just use it. He withdrew his hand and rose above her. He positioned the head of his cock at her entrance and slowly penetrated her. His own eyes closed when he felt her orgasm squeeze him. She was so hot and wet that he couldn't be inside her and not move. With his hips thrusting softly at first, he set up a rhythm that she soon joined. He braced his hands on either side of her face and steadily drove within her tight sheath. Why? She urged him on with her hands and legs. Her seductive gaze held his, and the wonder and pleasure he saw in her depths surprised him. With his own orgasm rapidly approaching, Darius thrust harder and deeper. He saw the flush on her chest, and her eyes glazed over a moment before her body stiffened. He watched in amazement as once more she climaxed. Because, women can't have multiple climaxes. Like, this dude has been alive for thousands of years, and he's never come across a woman who has had multiple orgasms. Maybe he's just not that good in bed then. It was such a beautiful sight that he couldn't get enough. The slight curve of her lips, the way her breast heaved, the carnality that shone in her eyes. It all sent him careening over the edge. Darius pumped inside her with hard, fast strokes where he buried himself deep and let the orgasm take over him. The pleasure was intense, potent. Sorry, there was no conversation in there of whether it was okay for him to do that inside of her. Like, you should never assume. You should always ask first, okay? Like, you should always be sure. First of all, you should be sure if you can go without a condom. Secondly, you should be sure if you can, in fact, do this inside of a woman. Just ask, you guys. Just ask. 'Cause that's not okay. Totally not okay. As he stared into Sophie's olive eyes, all he wanted to do was kiss her again. He lowered his head and took her lips while their bodies still shuddered from the ecstasy. When he withdrew from her, Darius didn't get dressed and leave. He rolled to his back with his fingers entwined with Sophie's. For every moment that he remained, it grew harder and harder to leave. Yet if he wanted her far from the war that the Dragon Kings were involved in, he needed to do just that. Darius turned his head toward her, ready to spout a lie that would allow him to leave, only he found her asleep. He turned toward her and ran the back of his fingers along her jaw and cheek. Farewell, Doc. There you go. That was chapter 7. Kind of fucked up, just leaving like that, by the way. At least leave a note, woman's lips. Alright, guys. I'll see you next time with Chapter 8. Happy Valentine's Day!